Hi, everybody. I'm Paul Yeager. Welcome into another installment of the MTOM Show podcast from the Market to Market studio. Oh, boy, what have I gotten myself into? But who else to bring my wildness? It's Colleen Krantz, everybody. She's joining us again because why? You always put up with my crazy ideas.
Yes, because Paul Yeager seems to be able to talk me into trying anything, and I don't know why, because I am a behind-the-camera person, and all of a sudden, here I am on camera.
On camera,
I don't know how this happened, but...
So you can kind of tell, this is the view, that camera right there is behind where I normally sit for the market show, and that's what I look at all the time. And so that is the old... actually, little story, before we moved here more than 10 years ago, the TV show used to be over there in the studio here at Iowa PBS, and that's where the show is produced from. And big thanks today, Sean Ingrassi is directing, Kevin Rivers helping out, doing everything else that Sean is doing. They're going along saying, seriously, Paul, this is what we're doing? Just like you, see?
Yes,
there's more people in the club.
You get a lot of that, don't you?
Yeah, I do. We need to go, and the reason I want to show this whole behind-the-scenes business is because we're going to do a behind-the-scenes discussion. You always are great to tell us about what you've been working on. We just, on the show, Friday, released your latest story. It's about Great Lakes shipping. Where did this idea come from?
I had been looking for stories because I was planning a trip to Wisconsin and Minnesota in that area, and I can't even remember where I ran across it now, but I was doing some reading about Duluth area and ran across this fact that they were getting ready to send out their first ever dedicated container ship, and it seemed odd to me. First of all, I didn't really had never really thought about that they do bulk shipping all the time, but this was different, so. And it had just happened, so it was within a week of me going there in June. So I thought I got to go tell that story because of all the COVID-related complications with travel.
Right, and the container ship story has long been a thing that we've talked about in California, Savannah, Georgia, New Orleans, wherever. But there's been stories about what's going on in Detroit and Toronto and on Lake Ontario and Erie and all of these things. But Duluth, why have they not done container ships up there before?
Well, really, nobody does. I mean, they can all bring in like small numbers of containers, but really it's for a few years ago, I guess, the federal government kind of shut that down because they were trying to control too many ports, watch too many, and then COVID came, and now they're, maybe we should allow this or set up more options. And Cleveland was one of the only, I think it was the only one at the time doing shipping containers, and they had somehow been grandfathered in when everyone else wasn't really supposed to be doing it. So it really was just Cleveland on the Great Lakes sending out large container ships. And so the Duluth, hearing a lot of, and we talked to one dry bean company, a kidney bean company that's the largest exporter in the world, actually, in Wisconsin. And they just talked a lot about how difficult it got to find a solution to exporting out of there. And so I think Duluth heard some of that from people in the area and started moving ahead some of the infrastructure changes and federal approval process.
But does the end of the season for the dry bean line up with, let's say, the water and it doesn't freeze over at Duluth?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good catch because it is. It's a 9-month season, basically. You lose the St. Lawrence Seaway is iced over 2 to 3 months unless they, break it out, but they don't usually. So it is a limited season, but I think they felt like they were holding, during COVID anyway, they were holding dry beans so long and getting stuck in, whether it was a Chicago rail yard or Twin Cities, they just couldn't get another route out. And so it was, even getting 9 to 10 months felt like it was a better option, even if it comes right at harvest, that it's going to be, get it out quick as you can. I think they did 200 containers on their first almost 200 containers on their first ship full of dry beans. So,
okay, Duluth is a beautiful place. They have a great couple of cameras that you can watch the ports up there. I love it in the fall, great summer nights, the winter when it's so cold up there. Where are things going? Because you can really only go one way.
Yeah,
right?
It's basically, they basically head out. They come in by rail, and Duluth did a lot of improvements on the rail lines coming into the port, and then they basically head out through the Great Lakes into the St. Lawrence Seaway, eventually past Montreal, which is a big port on the Canadian side. And that's the one that this dry bean company, Chippewa Valley Bean, was trying to reach by rail, and they just couldn't find a way to get there. because of sort of barriers in the U.S. rail yards.
Because of COVID? Is this a pre-COVID issue?
Not so much. No,
But it was a post-COVID issue
Yes.
on getting on rail because rail became in such high demand?
Yeah, it was basically backed up, and finding containers was the other piece of it, because containers weren't coming back once you sent them out. Everybody was fighting for those. So they were trying to go out of the Twin Cities, and for various reasons, that sort of eventually slowed to shut down. Montreal had some labor strikes early in COVID and slowdowns later. And then sometimes you'd have maybe a labor issue somewhere else. I think Oakland has been working through one right now, and so that all flows somewhere else then, or it just creates a huge backup.
So even stuff in Duluth is impacted by what happens in Oakland or Savannah or New Orleans.
Yeah, it's amazing, because I think everybody started looking at, especially when the West Coast ports had trouble, they started looking, maybe we should use the East Coast ports more. And so that means people are trying to cross, almost everybody has to go through Chicago to get there from this middle of the country region. And a few places to the south can take shipments, but basically put a lot of pressure trying to go through some of these middle of the country rail depots, and it was just too much. So they'd sit for months and months,
When were you in Duluth?
It was in early June, and I think it'd been like the week before, like late May, when the first ship went out. First ever large dedicated container ship, basically. So.
And when you say dedicated container ship, I mean, how big? I mean, you've seen it in the LA port yourself. You've been to the LA port. I've been to the port. Those are those 5 to 7 stacked high. How tall are these? Yeah,
this is nothing like that. This is, I think, the ship that went out here was 500 feet long. I'm not sure how high they stack the containers, but it's not to the scale that you'd see in the coast or the big ports, and they don't expect to ever run that kind of volume out of the Great Lakes, but they sort of just see it as a sort of a pressure relief valve to have another option if you get stuck, basically.
Who did you shoot with?
Actually, I went on my own on that trip and ended up, except for the last part of the trip, we're on a different story. I worked with Wisconsin PBS station there, so. I'm
gonna put you on the spot. Which, did you work with a specific person? Because I think you did
but I'm going blank on her name right now.
But you did some cool, you've done a lot. We've talked about that on this podcast before, about how you've become our bridge to other PBS stations.
Oh, I love it, because I sit here and think we have so many PBS stations around the country that are really good at what they do, and a lot of them sitting right in the middle of ag country, so. I always think if we're all tied up here, our videographers are busy, so there's people all over the country that we can beg for help.
And they know the area that you're going to.
Yes, and they know people, and they'll know those little details that you can't just always drop in and understand immediately. And I feel bad I can't think of her name, but she was, it was great working with Wisconsin on this story, and like I worked with Montana and Colorado. I can't even list them all, but Idaho, I believe, and North Dakota. It's just great to have those additional resources.
Colleen, our one-person marketing team who works with everybody. Network outreach, we should change your title yet again, right? We'll make you network program outreach coordinator.
Or maybe it has to do with the fact that I don't grab our videographers early enough, so I'm just not as organized and getting people fast.
Well, there's a whole lot of internal politics I could reveal here now, but this is behind the scenes, but I don't need to go that far behind the scenes. So that story aired. Is there a natural follow-up to it that you think in the future, just to kind of see how much this path gets used and other people get used? Is that where the natural next step is?
Well, I think maybe we are actually, speaking of working with other stations, Great Lakes Now is a show that Detroit produces at the PBS station there. And I think they had sort of looked at the same story I'm telling, and Dave Miller, our executive producer, is considering airing that also, which would look at more of the Cleveland story. We're going to touch on it in my story a little bit, but it's more of Cleveland's been doing it a little bit longer and has sort of built it up a bit more because they've had some more time. So so that's what we're doing, and that'll be the next step to the story. I think we'll have to come back in a year and see how the traffic's played out.
Good job on putting Dave on the spot to approve that story.
Yeah, no pressure now, right?
That's good, right. You went up there in June. That story airs here in August. Available always on the YouTube channel, all of your stories if you want to go back. We also haven't talked to you in a while. This one's coming up. This one is about Native American food sovereignty.
Yes.
This one is a complete different turn for us on the outside.
Yeah.
Why were you drawn to it?
I ran across a really small, like, sort of, I almost could have looked it over, but it was a federal press release. I can't remember which division of the federal government had a press release about a change in policy. And if you read through it, it's really changing decades of rules related to the original peace treaties with Native Americans that said we have to provide, as a government, we have to provide food and schooling and so on at our expense. But the way it played out over time was that the money would be sort of required to be purchased, or this food would have to be what you bought. You have to buy it, and I'm not sure all the details, but basically it was like canned and processed and so on. And it was not like the money was never sent to them to spend as they choose. It was, except for among these foods that you've been given. So the idea is that several tribes, and I think some leadership came out of the state of Wisconsin, the tribes that are located in that area, really took some leadership, joined by, I think, some Oklahoma tribes, and really all over the country, in pushing for food sovereignty. Basically, the idea that they can take the federal money that they're due for food and pay their own producers. So it's like buying local, basically. So you could buy from native or non-native farmers and fishermen, orchards in that area, instead of having to buy what they thought was less healthy anyway, the more canned and processed foods. So I ended up visiting 3 different nations in Wisconsin area, and sort of telling the story from each of these different sort of regions where they had different food focuses.
So food sovereignty, what does that mean?
It basically means you control your food choices a little more.
But because sovereignty, I mean, we hear that in treaty talks.
Yes.
It's being able to control your own area.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's what you're saying, in food area. So you said, I think you said something about if there's somebody who fishes nearby in Wisconsin, or an orchard, and I think you said one other thing. So that's all, that mechanism was working before, and it wasn't financially viable to use local or buy local?
They couldn't use government funds to buy from anyone who's a producer, and it really didn't encourage Native people to sell unless it was sort of an informal, I mean, they could sell on their own, but now you have a ongoing reliable source of funds, the required payments sort of for food, and now you can actually better support those producers. So I went to Red Cliff Nation, which is Bayfield. It's really just north of Bayfield on Lake Superior. And they have a small fishery called Red Cliff Fish Company. And it was just fascinating, because they talked about how their native fishermen going out 5 in the morning and coming back with these Lake Superior fish are now getting about double what they did before, because it changed. They were selling to private individuals before. Now they have the sort of government competition, essentially, because the tribes can buy their own food with the government funds.
Okay.
And so now it drove up the prices to a living standard, I would say. It sounded, from what I'm told by some of the tribe members I spoke to, they were getting so little before it was barely worth going out and spending the gas money on the boat. So
it's a win on 2 sides.
Yeah. I think the federal, or both, you mean as far as the businesses and the
businesses and the customer,
yes.
for lack of a better term, I think, and probably the region. Then, if money is actually funneling from one, I shouldn't use that with government. If I use the word funneling, that means something different. But it's going into the hands of a customer to a business who wasn't making money before. So I mean, it is helping 2 different groups of people.
Yes, that's right. And there's, and you could see it in other locations where we visited an orchard and actually an Angus herd and buffalo herd too, that they had started having better results, because you're basically broadening your buying power. Your marketing is broader now, because now you can sell to the tribes themselves too.
When do we think we'll see this story?
I think that's coming in about a month. I can't remember the exact date right now, but it should be about a month out, I think.
Okay.
So soon.
Again, watch the show for that. Anything else on the show? You said you worked with 3 different tribes. Yeah,
so Red Cliff and Oneida and Menominee.
Okay, I couldn't remember if you'd said them all, but I wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
You updated a story here in the time I was gone, I think, from the show, about sunflowers, and we're seeing all these wonderful photos again as in August, September is the time people go out. It was a big COVID thing where this is an outdoor activity. Let's go to the sunflower patches and get pictures. But there's more to the story than just beautiful backdrop for photos that you had found. I've done a previous MTOM about sunflowers. We've featured it on the show. Sunflowers then all of a sudden became a whole nother story when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, because we learned that the two are 50% of the world's exports.
Yes.
How did that story come about?
Yeah, so that's just with the war going on there, it completely, as you know, it completely changed the oil seed markets. And so originally there were some drought issues last harvest, or leading into last harvest, where now some of those northern regions don't have that same issue, but the south it does, but they're irrigated there in the south. So the sunflowers are anyway. So I think that the country is going to be able to, since we did this story the first time around, it looks like there'll be probably a lot more supply coming out. Having said that, there was a lot of competition for the ground, because soybeans also were looking good. I mean, there was a lot of competition, I guess, a lot of crops that people felt this could be a strong year. So basically that did give a push, though, and the question is whether it will sustain through harvest. So that's what we were sort of talking about, if people bought early, holding on to supplies or not. So
we may have just, now that I think about this, we may have podcasted about your story because there was one tale. Colleen's always pushing the envelope when it comes to what I can post or should post on social media. You had the farmer involved in that story. Do you think we can show this shot? And it was him with a gun. It ends up in the story, and that was his effort to get rid of the birds that were causing problems for his crop, right?
Yeah, blackbirds they can wipe out half of a sunflower crop once they find it, and they stay once they find it too. So they shoot or scare the birds away, and
And you shot that where?
That was in South Dakota.
Which I later found, my mother, after she saw that story, she says, well, that's where some of your family is from.
It was the town of White Lake, is that the right?
It's near White Lake.
Yes.
Yeah, and I have the number from the guy, and I probably should call and just say, hey, do you know, and just go back a ways. But it was kind of fun that you were within half a mile, I think, of where some of my grandparents, great-grandparents had lived at one time.
Yeah, not too far west of Mitchell.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that area in South Dakota. So we see that update. You also, news story was on pulse crops. Overview of pulse crops is? Yeah,
and that was really about how, actually, it did be dry beans again, but also dry peas have done well. And I'm forgetting another crop, but basically some of these, what they call pulse crops, which are, legumes that are where the seeds are edible. Those pulse crops are starting to gain acres. And so I think 3 or 4 now have pushed beyond 1 million acres. Chickpeas was, and it fell back. I think it's lentils is the other I forgot, but they're all over 1 million acres, which isn't a ton nationally, but I do think they're all have markets that are looking strong. And
well, people who sit in that chair on the market show, we talk about acreage battles all the time, and if you start taking 500,000 here and 500,000 there, it adds up.
Yeah.
So yes, the percentage is huge for the lentils.
Yes.
Maybe not so much when it comes to talking corn and soybeans, but it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Who's driving people planting and switching acres?
I would say it's probably the people like this Chippewa Valley bean. That's an exporter. They're finding the buyers, and they're offering prices to try to compete with corn and soybeans. So it's really those people who are finding the end markets. And, for example, like look at dry peas. That's, I think it used to be mostly used for cattle feed, if I have this right, but always was sort of a protein powder option and fiber, and so it's becoming more common in beverages and so on. And that's one where I think there's probably, supposedly black beans also, but those are ones that are going to probably continue to see growth as long as people are looking for protein drinks and high fiber, and so.
Alternatives.
Yeah.
We're all looking for protein alternatives.
Yep.
And I shouldn't say we all, because there's plenty of meat producers who want no part of this, but it's also...
Including my rancher father, probably. I don't know if I could get him to try anything.
You could try.
You could try.
We'll close up with this. recent episode. Well, before I close with this, do you have anything else before we go into our last topic that's kind of a Debbie Downer?
I think we covered all of them except for the national project that we're talking about.
Well, and that's what we're going to get to.
Okay.
So a recent episode on this podcast, in fact, the most recent one right before this one, was with Jason Heglin, and we talked rural mental health. Jason's fifth-generation farmer, who also was a psychologist, has training in counseling, has developed a business since COVID that is strictly for rural mental health. And it kind of ties into what you have been involved with, and one of our old friends, producer on the show, Laurel Bauer. What are you doing?
So the PBS National had a grant that the Twin Cities Public Television ended up sort of leading this project looking at suicides and mental health nationwide. And so they pulled in multiple affiliates around the country, and Iowa PBS has a role in that. And my part in it was to do a story that would be on Market to Market coming up in early September. And my focus was looking at especially looking at how rural law enforcement has to confront mental health over and over, and has probably some training, but not a lot usually. And so we took a look at how the state of Iowa has now passed rules that every county has to have a mobile response team, like a mental health crisis response team that has to get to any location in the state within 60 minutes, has to be able to. And it's really interesting because it has, I think some of the police and sheriff's departments were a little skeptical having to call in another person and wait for them sometimes, but at least in Sioux City, which isn't extremely rural, of course,
No.
but they've sort of tracked the response and what that has meant, having these teams go after the police department arrives and sort of secures the situation. And they've determined that it's saving a half hour per call. For every call like this, they're saving an average of a half hour for the police department or the sheriff's department. And but it was really interesting because we were able to get some Sioux City Police Department shared some body cam footage that was from one of these calls in the months before we were doing the story, and where a man was suicidal and sitting in his higher window, and they were able to. The police department had things under control, but they were really ready to go, and they had other calls to get to, I'm sure. But that's when the mental health professionals were able to come in and sit with this gentleman who was in this video we had. So it's really a step. I don't think anyone thinks it's going to solve all the issues with mental health and availability and having enough beds, but it's an interesting approach that's being tried. So.
Or who should be going to facilities with beds, and who
Yes.
should be staying at home. Because
Yes.
mental health has issues where someone might finally get the right combination of medicine and medication to get them feeling better, and then once that person starts feeling better, they alter themselves and medicate differently or not at all,
Yeah.
and gets them into this situation. But is mental health like other health, where we're doing more in the home? I mean, are you finding that, yes, if I'm removed rurally from an urban area, I'm still trying to be in my home? That's what's most important to help my well-being?
Yeah, they're trying to, I think that the new models, I would say, try to keep you as close to your home as possible. And what I ran into, and so I also went to Sac County. So Sac City is in, what do you call it, Northwest Iowa. Mm-hmm. So the sheriff there was really interesting to talk to, because he talked a lot about, and the mental health team that's located there, they talked about the importance of that, trying to let them stay in their community and not have to go stay 2 hours away or drive an hour and a half to get to see a professional. So COVID brought about a couple things, and one was telehealth which a lot of mental health professionals were skeptical of, and now I think they buy into it, and they say this is a really good answer for small town people that don't want to go park in front of the building where you're getting counseling, because everybody will know.
Especially if it's local in a small town.
Yes.
It's one thing if
Yes.
you're in Sac County to go to Sioux City.
Yes.
The people aren't going to
Yes.
know me in Sioux City. They're going to know me in Sac City.
Yeah, and imagine being a farmer, you're trying to get the harvest in and don't have time, but you need to go. Well, that's go in your house for half an hour and have your session, and you're back out in the field. I think there's a lot of people buying into that. But what the Sac County Sheriff told me the problems are that continue are when the state sort of went to private hospital care for mental health and got away from their the 4 or 5 big hospitals in the state. There's probably some good changes that came with that, but he saw it as like now some hospitals are doing what he calls cherry picking, and if they know someone and they've dealt with this person over and over, they just don't really want to admit them. And so that person might be sitting in a waiting room when they're not going to get admitted, and the sheriff's departments get called. And because these small hospitals don't have security, and if you don't feel safe at the hospital, the professionals working there, then they want somebody there. And it's the sheriff's departments that get called to come sit for 6 or 7 hours, and that's all time that they feel like they could be doing something else.
Yeah.
But they can't ignore it either, so.
You and I have spent plenty of time in newsrooms listening to police scanners, especially on the second shift. We know that the second shift police officer, not exclusively, mind you, deals with a lot of domestic abuse, domestic issues. It's now become more into what maybe used to have been a domestic situation as a mental health situation.
Yeah.
Is there any training at all for those officers? I mean, you mentioned the whole, I have to call in somebody and wait, because we're asking our law enforcement to do so much.
Yeah.
Is there any, did they tell you anything, law enforcement? Yeah, this is okay because they are better trained to do this, or I'm going to get better at helping someone.
I think they all feel like they still have to get better or be good at it already, because some of that is you get just a sort of crisis training. I think every officer gets some kind of crisis training, crisis intervention. And so when you first arrive, I would feel like the great majority are ready for that if they sort of have the right temperament and experience. And they can be actually really skilled at handling that first arrival, but even professionals are going to struggle sometimes. And so I do think that if they can get the situation to a sort of a calmer point, I think there is relief in handing that off to very trained professionals, at a much higher skill level for this specific area.
And not putting an officer maybe necessarily in a position that they are not trained for to the best that they could be, that a mental health professional is.
Yes. For example, the video we have from Sioux City happens to be on being worn by an officer who used to be a mental health counselor, which is really unusual. But it just happened to be that he switched careers and went the police or law enforcement route, but he knows what he's doing because he has that experience. But that's not going to be your normal situation, and sometimes if you don't know what their mental health issue is, it's like, how do you address what sort of the unknown if you come in blind? That I would say the one advantage for small towns is sometimes you know the person and you might have a better rapport because you can call them by name right away without having to ask who they are. But that can also be a downside too.
Because law enforcement's not allowed to cherry pick like a hospital was doing.
Yes.
They have to respond.
Yes, they have
and they know, we're going to I'm just using a generic name here, the Joneses.
Yeah.
Again.
Yeah, exactly. And so Sheriff McClure is the sheriff in Sac County, and he actually grew up in the jailhouse. It's still there and still used as the jail as a child because his dad was a deputy, and so he actually lived in the jail and talked about he has these good stories of just waking up at night because inmates are rattling their cell cages, I guess you could call it. But he also talked about how sad it is that for a long time that was seen as the only option in rural areas, like you put them in jail, and he feels really strongly that's not right. Someone just because they have a mental health issue should not have to be in jail, or maybe that spins into substance abuse, which puts them in jail. And so he had pretty strong feelings about that this is not right. We should be getting them, health care, not law enforcement care. And so.
Okay, refresh us again. So there'll be a story kind of putting a lot of this for market to market, and then a grant through TPT, Twin Cities Public TV.
Yep.
Will we see this on other regional stations between the two of us?
Yeah, I think it's, so I don't have the full big picture yet, but I think essentially there's going to be a documentary released through TPT that I think is going to be broadcast by all the affiliates. And then the various affiliates will have their own. I'm not sure which of those are being released besides ours, not through market to market nationally, but I know like Nebraska is involved, and 3 or 4 other states are involved in doing pieces of this.
Okay.
And I do think they'll package it under one sort of brand called Facing Suicide.
And so you and Laurel are the primary ones
And
from
Tyler.
this. And Tyler Brinegar
Yes.
have been working on these different pieces. And so will we see a specific program on Iowa PBS too?
Yes, we should be able to, or there should be linked together on
Okay.
on our website. So.
Okay. On the Iowa PBS website, not necessarily through the
Yes.
market-to-market site, but
Yeah.
we can tweet some of those out. All right. Anything else that I'm forgetting? Did I leave any complete bull stories out of here?
I don't think
Can't really
so.
talk about all your other projects, but she's a busy, busy person. If you see Colleen at the State Fair, say hi.
Yes,
you got
I'll be there.
some fun assignments?
I'll be there for a couple different food-related
Ooh,
stories.
food!
So,
You
yes.
graduated from the
I am not in the
shows?
livestock ring again this
Wow.
time. I'm doing food
So
stories. So.
over to the Elwell Family Food
Yes,
Center.
yes, a couple food stories. So.
All right, looking good for all sorts of things. Colleen, thank you so very much. If you
Thank
have
you.
any story tips for her, send an email to
Colleen.Krantz, which is KRANTZ at iowapbs.org.
right there on the screen. Colleen, thank you.
All right, thank you.
All right. Again, that is going to do it for this episode of the MTOM podcast. That's Colleen. My thanks to Sean and Kevin who are helping make this look a little different. Like I said, this is the back of the studio. Why not a behind-the-scenes look from, behind the scenes? That's always good. See? Kevin even made an appearance like he always likes to do. Again, if you have any feedback for me or the show, send it to market at Iowa PBS. Otherwise, we'll see you this weekend on the TV show and next Tuesday when a new episode is released. Bye-bye.